as we were just saying, MPs will soon vote on introducing a lifetime smoking ban for anyone born after 2008. At least 50 Conservative MPs are set to defy Rishi Sunak and vote against the bill, with the Business Secretary, Kemi Badenoch, reportedly among them.
And it's not just sitting MPs who are in opposition. The former Prime Minister Boris Johnson has also made his thoughts known. He did this last week. Let's have a listen to Boris.
We're banning cigars. And what is? I mean, maybe you all think that's a great idea. I just can't see what is the point of banning? Well, the party of Winston Churchill wants to ban. I mean, donnez-moi un break, as they say in Quebec. You know, it's just mad.
That's Boris on Rishi there. Meanwhile, the Chief Medical Officer for England, Professor Chris Whitty, has urged MPs to ignore the opposition and vote with the government, insisting the ban will save lives. Sam and Chris are still with us. Let's get to you first, Chris. What is it about politicians that they want to stick their nose into our lives all the time? I mean, you know, smoking's bad. Don't do it, kids. It's very bad for your health. But it's not illegal. And I find it disconcerting that we have a government that wants to crack down on a perfectly legal activity and tell us we can't do something. Why do MPs always want to stick their nose into our lives?
I think, frankly, it's displacement. You know, if you look at the last 14 years of government, maybe more than 14 years, but certainly the last 14 years of Conservative-led government, very little has been achieved. You know, we haven't built a new reservoir since 1991. We haven't built a new power station since 1995. There's 6 million people and NHS waiting list. You know, you go on about everything that the government is supposed to be providing us. It's failing to do. And so I think it keeps itself busy by regulating the public. You know, the message seems to be that somehow the government would function well if it weren't for individuals living in an unhealthy way or doing things they shouldn't be doing. And so they're constantly regulating us. And in the case of this particular ban, I think, you know, Rishi Sunak wants some kind of legacy. He hasn't really got one otherwise. In a way, I think he's copying Tony Blair, who brought in the original smoking ban, which wasn't a ban on sales, obviously it was a ban on smoking. That was a legacy thing. You know, in reality, he's going to be remembered for Iraq, and I suspect Sunak will be remembered for plunging his party into electoral oblivion. But it's something to do, rather like net zero with Theresa May.
But one actually assumes that when it comes to these sort of, you know, faddy-type bits of legislation, because this is going to make us the strictest on smoking in the whole world. No one was really, I didn't think, asking for this. It wasn't a bonfire that needed to be put out. One assumes that he runs it past his, you know, data crunchers and, you know, Isaac Levido or whoever is sitting there at the top of the tree telling him what he should and shouldn't do to not win as disastrously as he's going to. And they get a few focus groups together and then they go, this policy is popular or this policy is going to crash and burn. I mean, do you think out there is a sort of, you know, caucus of people saying that's what we want the Prime Minister to do?
I don't think it's a top priority for anybody, certainly, but I think it is actually surprisingly popular. And even among smokers, when you ask them, would you want your children to smoke, they say no. So it's actually more popular than you might think. And also, I think we saw in COVID, people actually quite liked the nanny state. People liked being told what to do in a way that actually was very surprising even to Boris Johnson. He thought he was going to meet resistance by telling people to stay at home, to not do this, not do that. And actually, people quite happily took those instructions and wanted more.
Yeah.
So I think it is quite popular. I think it is a legacy issue, as Chris mentioned. But I think, you know, if that is your legacy, I think it's kind of small fry, isn't it?
I'm not entirely convinced it is popular. I think it's one of those things that a lot of people feel they ought to say, including MPs, and that is, you know, it's really bad if kids smoke. Let's bring in some kind of law to stop kids smoking because it could really harm their health. Of course you're going to go, no, don't do that. Let the kids get sick. No one's going to say that. So I think what we're talking about is a kind of virtue signalling, people saying the right thing, but I'm not sure they genuinely believe it. I mean, I just think this is illiberal and un-British, to be honest with you, Chris.
Yeah, and it also depends how you ask the question. I honestly think a lot of people don't really understand the policy. Quite honestly. If you ask them the question, do you think people when they're 18 should be allowed to smoke? Most people say yes. If you say, do you think 15-year-olds now should never be allowed to buy cigarettes? They say, yes, they shouldn't. I mean, how that's kind of cognitive dissonance there. You're treating people who are 15 now as if they're never going to be adults. And this is one of the absurdities, obviously, of the policy, is that these people who are 15, 14, 13 now, very soon are going to be men and women. And are we really going to say, you can't buy tobacco, I can buy tobacco, we can all buy tobacco, you can't? It's just creating this weird sort of generational unfairness and two-tier society.
How is it going to be enforced? Does that mean every time someone wants to buy a packet of cigarettes, then all of a sudden you have to hand over your driver's licence with your date of birth? And if you're seen smoking a cigarette on the street in about 30 years' time or something like, well, we better check that you were born on a particular date or you're going to have to put that out. It just seems
It's not going to be a ban on possession, at least not initially. It will be a ban only on sales, but not just of cigarettes, by the way, of cigars, of heated tobacco, of cigarette papers, of anything that can encase tobacco. You read the legislation, it's quite extraordinary what's been proposed. And yes, the retailers will have to ask anyone who looks under the age of whatever it is at the time.
15, by the time we're going to eventually get to that.
But I mean,
5-0, eventually you're going to have middle-aged people turning up having said behind.
All over the world, world leaders looked to Jacinda Ardern as a reverse barometer. Whatever she's doing, don't do it. Rishi Sunak looked at her. She came in with this smoking ban. The sane people of New Zealand have got hold of the ship again and completely banned her ridiculous smoking ban, which was exactly the same as Rishi's. Rishi looked at this, illiberal fascistic policy and said, yeah, I'll have some of that. Why do you think that is?
I think, well, as I said before, legacy, I think, is part of it. But also, there's something with Rishi Sunak in which he just bans things he doesn't like and he subsidises things he does like. You look at what he's done with cricket last week, for example. More subsidies for cricket. We've got subsidies for chess because he likes playing chess. He doesn't like disposable vapes. He's got a couple of young daughters. Yes. He doesn't want them to be offered disposable vapes, so they're being banned. He doesn't want them to try a cigarette when they go to university, so they'll never be legally allowed to buy cigarettes. He wants to ban smartphones for the under 16. You look at this, really, you look at it in the round. I mean, aside from behaving more or less like a Roman emperor and just doing whatever he wants and living his best life for the next few months until he gets kicked out of office, he seems to be policing his domestic life through legislation.
All this banning, though, it's not very conservative, is it?
It's not conservative at all. No, of course not. And these are it's a Labour policy, right? It's New Zealand Labour Party policy. Wes Streeting, Shadow Health Secretary, started talking about how he's quite interested in this idea. He's very anti-smoking and very anti-vaping. What's going to happen is we're going to have this ban come in. The MPs, apart from a few principal Tories, are going to vote for it. And then what does Wes Streeting do to have a legacy? He was going to ban it for everybody. And he's going to probably ban vaping for everybody as well.
But what I don't get is this. I get the impression, I don't sort of, look at these on a regular basis, but I get the impression that young people taking up smoking is at an all-time low. I just don't think they're doing it anymore. They've got the public health message. It's not cool anymore. It's not sort of everywhere you look on television and in films. It doesn't seem to me they're doing it much. And yet all the reports that I've ever seen on vaping, and albeit people might say, well, it's quite new, we don't know the long-term effects, blah, 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 blah. They said it's 95% safer than smoking, and that's going as well. It doesn't even seem to be based on science.
No, I think it does seem to be more of a kind of mindset, doesn't it? We just don't like that in principle. But I think you've seen these kind of illiberal pieces of legislation from the Conservative government on smoking for quite some time in the coalition era. They banned smoking in cars if you have a child in the car. Now, obviously, that was a completely pointless piece of legislation. I think in the first year, only one person was prosecuted in that. But it's one of those things that it looks good, it sounds like we're looking after children. But you can't ban it in somebody's house, can you? I mean, the logical extension of that would be you ban smoking in houses where there are children. But clearly, that really would be a kind of step into a very dangerous world, wouldn't it?
It's like the sugar tax, isn't it?
Yeah.
Now, as you alluded to, Chris, I mean, the reason that this bill, the smoking bill, is going to sail through, it's not because of Tories, although several Tory ministers have indicated they might vote against. I hope they do. It's because of Labour. Labour are going to sail this through. So going forward, let's assume they win the next election. I think it's a fair bet. We're going to get a lot more of this nanny statism from Labour, aren't we?
I don't know 100%, but I very much suspect we will, partly because Labour are going to have so little money to spend. When Blair came in, he could splurge a huge amount of cash on various public services, and people kind of felt the benefit of that. The nanny statism under Blair didn't come until a lot later. He actually deregulated licensing laws and gambling, if you remember. But then we got the nanny state stuff later, partly legacy issues again. I think that particularly given Wes Streeting does seem to be an instinctive nanny statist, because the Labour Party will not be able to spend a lot of cash, they're going to look at things that make an impact which will be around food, vaping, smoking, drinking, gambling, and I would think they're going to be very heavy-handed on all these things. And there's an obvious slippery slope here now, because we've seen people saying, you know, Chris Whitty today saying, smoking's a leading cause of preventative death, we need to ban it. Well, what's the second leading cause, right? That's presumably going to be the next thing in the firing line. I imagine it's obesity, if not alcohol. So prohibition is now very much on the cards. We're seeing it, albeit in this weird, gradual way. And that will now be the benchmark for everything else. So people should be very wary of this, even if they don't smoke themselves.
Yeah, I wish this lot would just leave us alone, but they cannot find it within their hearts to do so. Chris Snowden from the Institute of Economic Affairs. Great to see you in person, at long last.
And there you go, kids. Fun ends in 2024, so get as much of it while you can.
Yeah, new policy. No more fun.
No more fun.